Hello, and welcome to Redistricting the Good, the Bad, and the Dirty Work, hosted by the League of Women Voters, St. Paul. My name is Bridget Adams, and I am honored to be the Communications Manager for the League of Women Voters, St. Paul. For over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has worked as a citizens' league to improve our government and engage all citizens in the decisions that impact their lives. We join the efforts of 800 state and local leagues to bring nonpartisan political advocacy, education, and empowerment to the local level. Thank you to Suburban Community Channels and the St. Paul Neighborhood Network for carrying their program to their viewers this evening. We appreciate the ongoing support. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are learning today on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota, Minnesota, and current home of many Native nations, including many Dakota and Ojibwe. The program tonight is being recorded and broadcasted on Facebook Live. If you are watching on Facebook Live, we welcome you to put your questions in the comment section. We will also be taking questions from the audience on Zoom. You can send your questions throughout the program using the Zoom Q&A feature at the bubble at the bottom of the screen. Please do not use the chat feature for questions. We will get to as many questions as possible at the end of Paul Huffman's presentation. Now to introduce our speaker. Paul Huffman has been the redistricting coordinator at the League of Women Voters, Minnesota, since June 2019. As a volunteer member of the state office staff, he works with national and state organizations to provide resources, tools, and information for the League of Women Voters, Minnesota local leagues and members, assisting them in census and redistricting efforts. Paul is also on the League of Women Voters Woodbury and Cottage Grove area voter service director and is a member of our MAPS MN Redistricting Steering Committee. Paul was a nuclear submarine officer in the United States Navy and retired from the U.S. Naval Reserves. Paul retired from Xcel Energy in 2019 as a general manager of nuclear fleet operations. He has a Bachelor in Science of Chemistry and a Master's in National Security Affairs, as well as an MBA. He is currently completing a graduate certification in election administration at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at University of Minnesota. Welcome, Paul Huffman, and thank you for leading tonight's program.
Thanks, Bridget. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to the league and also to everyone out there watching. This is a great opportunity, and I appreciate that. What I'm going to do this evening is, and Bridget said this is, about redistricting the good, the bad, and the dirty work, because there's good things, there's things that aren't so good, and then there's things that are kind of dirty work in a couple of different avenues, and we'll talk about that. My goal this evening is to provide some foundation for you to understand what redistricting is, why it matters, and why it's important to you, where you live, and how that process is done, and whether your voices are heard and included and addressed in that process. I want to talk about how the process works and what that means for Minnesota and what our experience has been in Minnesota. And then I'm going to talk about how that process could work in an ideal world to provide better representation for the public, for the voters such as you. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what some actions are that you can take that are tangible and meaningful to move forward. I want to start by first reinforcing that the League of Women Voters Minnesota is nonpartisan. What that means is that we neither support nor oppose candidates or political parties at any level of government. We are always working on vital issues of concern to our members and the public. That means, though, that we take principled positions on issues of policy, and that could mean that our positions may be perceived as partisan. But in the case of redistricting, this gerrymandering and abuse of the redistricting process is something that both parties have done and all parties have done in the history of the country. And I'll talk a little about that history and some examples. So I want to reinforce that we are not going to point fingers at one party or the other or say one's better or worse than the other. And this is a nonpartisan subject. And when I talked to friends of mine when I was retiring and I was saying, hey, I want to work on redistricting, and I explained the concept of, people choosing their representatives, not representatives choosing their voters, that resonates with everybody, regardless of what their ideology is, because it just doesn't seem right that elected officials at all levels of government should decide who the people are that are voting for them and then set that process up to ensure their ability to be reelected. So that's what I want to talk to you about this evening. What I'm going to first start with is the basics. And by the basics, I'm going to get real basic, because knowing that a lot of people may view this, don't want to assume anything by way of what your knowledge is about how government's set up. Our government, really from the state down to the county, down to the city level, is divided into districts. We have representatives based on geographic areas. On the left, what you see is the state of Minnesota divided into currently 8 congressional districts. That may go down to 7, depending on what happens with the census. And you see that there's big areas in the rural part of Minnesota, small areas in the urban areas of Minnesota, in the metro area. And that's because all of these are equal population. The one on the right shows you the state legislative and Senate districts. 67 Senate districts, 134 House districts in Minnesota. So, and again, the areas in rural Minnesota are bigger because they have less population. The areas in the metro and the cities are smaller because you have greater densities, but all are of equal population. That becomes important as I get along later. So how those maps are drawn makes a difference what your representation is and who you vote for. At the same time, places like the county is divided. All counties in Minnesota are divided into commissioner districts. Number of commissioners may vary depending on the population and the issues. Ramsey County has 7 commissioners, and there on the left, you see who those commissioners are in those 7 districts. And on the right, you see St. Paul is divided into city council wards, and 7 wards in the city of St. Paul. Again, those are roughly equal in population. And in all of these cases, the elected officials, except in St. Paul, I'll talk about that in a moment, but the county commissioners, they draw the maps. In St. Paul, the Charter Commission is the one who actually draws those maps. So knowing who draws the maps and what the rules are is really important. And what this gets at is why redistricting is important. What I want you to get out of this when we're done is that it's all about your community and what's important to your community. And we'll talk a little bit about what a community is, but those are the policy interests that pull people together. And where I live in Washington County, that can be water rights or water quality. In other areas, it could be transportation, it could be infrastructure, it could be agriculture, it could be economics. But what is important to your community and how your districts are drawn and whether your voices are being heard, is what determines what policy interests are served, what funds are expended on what different aspects of the needs of the community, what laws are passed, what projects are put forward. So there's a lot of things that come out of that. And we'll talk about whether specific group or community voices are diluted or whether they're isolated affects whether or not those voices are heard and whether or not those interests are served. And the last thing I want to say as we get further into this is I want you to think about policies that are important, not party. Because what party policy interests are can change over time. We've seen that over the last 10 to 20 years, that there have been changes in both parties of what their bases are, what their policy interests are. And that then affects what the issues are put forward. If you focus on what your policy interests are, and should your elected representatives understand your policy interests and are responsive to those, then that will benefit you. I also want to point out that at the county and the city level, those are nonpartisan positions. There may be some party interest and affiliation. Those are nonpartisan positions. So policy, not party, is the way to think. What I want to start with is now the timeline, because I think, we've talked about the census and COVID and a lot of things have gone on. And so the question is, okay, why is there any urgency to this? When is this all going to happen? And the short answer is now is the time to get involved, and now is the time to understand more. Normally, the census apportionment, when I'll talk about that, but that determines how many representatives each state gets in Congress. That would normally have been done by the end of December of 2020. But due to COVID delays and due to some data issues, that's been delayed now to April, and that's looking pretty firm that's going to be done in April. right now going on, and if you look at this slide, each one of these things that are bold and underlined is an opportunity for engagement. It's an opportunity to contact elected officials and legislators to understand what you can do and make an influence on what they're doing. So right here now in January to May is the legislative session. What this is an opportunity for potentially is influencing legislators to pass laws and legislation on the process for map development, for to start taking public input on maps, to establish criteria. Reality is not much has happened at this point. We have a split legislature, but it is an opportunity to contact legislators to talk to them about the importance of having clear objective criteria for redistricting so that it's a fair and open process. Here in September, and it may be as early as August, we'll get census block data. That is normally provided by the 1st of April. So that would normally happen during the legislative session, because by the Constitution of Minnesota, redistricting is supposed to take place in the legislative session after the census is done. We haven't got the census enumeration yet, so they can't do it. And that isn't going to happen until September or August. So that's the point at which the final map drawing can occur. That doesn't mean preparations can't be taken before that. And actually doesn't mean that there aren't actions being taken already by various groups to draw maps. And so that's ongoing. So that's the point at which the race is on to finalize maps to decide what those new districts are going to look like in 2022. And then legislative hearings at some point this fall and this winter, potentially there will be hearings on maps to be drawn by the House and the Senate. The House and the Senate, again, are different parties. It depends on what rules they set up as far as criteria and hearing process. Currently, there's very little in our laws on this, and I'll talk about that. So that's an opportunity to provide input on what you think the maps ought to look like and what they ought to be. Sometime this late summer is going to be establishment of what's called a special redistricting panel. In the last 3 cycles, 1992, 2002, and 2012, the Supreme Court established a redistricting panel made up of judges to draw the maps for the state. And that's because the legislature and the governor together have not been able to draw and agree on maps virtually at all in the last 60 years. So this is a process, and I'll repeat, that does not work. And so the courts always come in and draw the maps. In order to be ready, if the legislature and the governor don't reach an agreement, they will establish that redistricting panel probably in mid-August, just to get it set up, get their structure established, get their principles and process created, so that when that census block data is received, that panel is ready to start work and ready to be to deliver maps when needed. That means this fall is going to be an opportunity for input to the special redistricting panel. That means if your communities or your groups you're part of have drawn maps, you can submit maps. If you want us to provide testimony or input of some other nature about how you think the representative maps ought to be, that's the opportunity. That's going to be the window. Also happening this fall, and something that we forget about, is that those local governments, the city and the county, both also have to redistrict after the legislative redistricting is done. So this fall, and really there's no reason to stop, not ask now, but this fall is going to be when there should be decision-making hearings on process and public input and how it's going to work for city and county redistricting. And that's when you want to start getting engaged, want to be visible to those elected officials, make your interest known. And those maps that you provided for the redistricting panel and to the legislature, those same maps are going to be relevant when that redistricting is happening in St. Paul and in Ramsey County. A date I think you can pretty well circle on the calendar now is February 15th, 2022. That is a date driven by Minnesota statute on which the Supreme Court likely will issue its final redistricting order. All these other dates on here, I have estimated, underlined in the title on this slide, is because that is my best guess. And I've bounced this off a variety of other people who are experts, and they think these are all pretty reasonable. But based on where we are with the census and what's happening with the Census Bureau and what we're happening as a state government, that we think is a good timeline for what's going to happen, a good guess. That February 15th comes out of statute. In the last 3 cycles, what's happened is that on that date, and I'll take it back, the last 2 cycles, on that date is when the Supreme Court's issued its redistricting order. And that's because in both of those cases, the legislature and the governor could not reach agreement on the redistricting plan. When that happens, that kicks off the local redistricting. And that's the point at which what really happens first is once the legislative lines are drawn, cities and counties redraw precinct boundaries because you have to follow precinct boundaries for your city and county redistricting. And they will perform their redistricting. City by the end of March and the county by the end of April. So that's the opportunity for input for the local redistricting to make those maps reflect what's your interests, what your policy needs are, what your community needs are. So I'll do is I'll stop here real briefly, see if there's any question about the timeline before I move forward. And we'll take the more general questions at the end. And there's one other point I'll stop just to catch any specific questions, but I'll just stop and Bridget, any questions at this point?
We have an attendee asking if you could expand a little bit on how redistricting works for the county and city.
Sure, I will cover that a little later. And I'll make sure I cover that because I have a little bit on local redistricting toward the end. So I will talk about that. That's a great question. And not that I'm making any money in all of this stuff, but I do have a whole specific presentation I can do and talk about local redistricting because there's a lot to that. And that's a huge opportunity for engagement. So, but I'll talk about that more later. I appreciate that question.
Right.
All right.
Looks like we have one more question. Paul, it says, did you say the courts have stepped up the last 60 years?
Ever since 1960, and redistricting, I'll talk a little bit about timeline, but essentially since 1960, every 10 years, 2 maps are drawn, one for the legislature, one for the congressional seats. Every map except one in the last 60 years has been either rejected by the courts or drawn by the courts. In the last 3 cycles, in 92, and it was a very tangled web in 92 between the governor and the legislature and the U.S. Supreme Court. But essentially, in 92, 2002, 2012, the courts drew the maps. And this time around, it looks like the legislature may not even try to draw maps. That's a little disappointing. In the previous iterations in the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, maps were drawn and approved, but they were rejected by the courts and sent back for rework by the legislature and the governor. So I'll go ahead and move forward. So redistricting, and just some foundation. Following every census, the congressional seats around the nation are subject to change. That's apportionment. So we talk about apportionment, and that's what you're going to hear coming up here in April is going to be apportionment data. That is the federal piece of redistricting, which is just saying, here's how many congressional seats each state gets. And as I mentioned, we're on the bubble. We've had 8 since 1933, I think it is. We went from 9 to 8. So we're at risk of losing that 8th seat. We'll see what happens. But depending on what happens with that, then based on the census and apportionment data, reapportionment, then the state will then do redistricting, which is where the states draw congressional and state districts. Also, we talked about local redistricting that occurs that follows on from that, and that's all state level. And I'll talk a little bit about this, but every state decides how it's going to do it. And if you understand your constitutional law, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says that those things not specifically granted to the federal government belong to the states. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say how the states will do redistricting. Now, there's been case law over the years, especially in the 60s, that has done a lot to define what needs to be done within redistricting, in particular, the concept of one person, one vote, that districts are going to be substantially equal in population, and then some other legal standpoints around the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and ensuring opportunity for representation of minority communities. So other than those things, there's really not much in federal law or the Constitution. So I want to talk about gerrymandering. So you talk about redistricting as a concept. The bad thing, and the good, the bad, and the dirty work is gerrymandering. Now you can draw maps in a whole lot of different ways to get different results. On the right here, what you see is, a block of nominally 50 precincts, if you will, and you've got 20 of them are yellow, 30 of them are green. And you can draw a map of these in an infinite number of ways to define a variety of different representations. And what this is showing is you can draw one map that says that the green gets 100% of the representation. If you draw five districts, you can get 5 greens and no yellows. You can also draw one where and we'll talk about the terms cracking and packing here, but you can draw a district where the green, which is 60% of the population, is actually only getting 40% of the districts. And yellow, which is 40% of the population, gets 60% of the districts. You can do that. And you can draw maps when you get something as complex as the state of Minnesota. You can draw actually an infinite number of maps that are legal. Now, the term gerrymandering is named for Eldridge Gerry in 1812 in Massachusetts. Draw a map that went around the city of Boston, and that looked like a salamander, one editor said, and so call it a gerrymander. And actually, this whole concept of drawing maps for political purposes goes all the way back to the first election in the country, when in Virginia, the districts were drawn to put James Madison and James Monroe in the same congressional district, so James Madison lost the election to James Monroe in the very first congressional election. So this is as old as the country. What we do now is we talk about this as an extreme manipulation of district boundaries to draw a map that provides a political advantage. There's been racial gerrymandering historically that has divided communities of color, or that has disenfranchised particular interest groups between, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the two terms here, packing and cracking, we hear a lot. Wisconsin, there's a lot of cracking and packing that goes on. I've got relatives who live in Southeast Wisconsin, and packing is where, if you look on the far right of the green districts, you put as many of those greens as you can in one district. Okay, that minimizes the number available for the remaining districts. That's called packing. And cracking is what you see in the center example, is where you take a group of voters, a group, and you divide them up as much as you can to scatter their interest, to dilute it as much as possible. And that's called cracking. So experience shows with gerrymandering is that when all of the state government branches, what we call a trifecta, to get the House, the Senate, the governor's office, all in the same party, there's a high risk for gerrymandering, a high risk for that party to use the power to redistrict, to draw lines to partisan advantage. And what I will tell you in this is that my experience, and I believe this, is that our individual elected representatives are good, honest people with great integrity and honestly working to represent their constituents. At the same time, when you get a party with accumulated party interests, it is very difficult when you have that opportunity to not use it to partisan advantage. And this goes for every party that has been in this country. And Madison Monroe was before we even had political parties. So it is just very difficult to avoid. The reason gerrymandering is bad, I mean, we've got the obvious, which is that, hey, those districts aren't fair. What does that lack of fairness create? It creates maps that are safe and partisan seats where elected officials represent their political base. So they don't have to listen to the people that didn't vote for them. That's not who they represent. I know most representatives say, well, I represent everybody. But the reality is they're accountable to the people that voted for them, and the people are going to vote for them next time. And for many of those gerrymandered seats, the real election is in the primary. And that's why you hear a lot of talk about people getting primaried, because that's where the real race is, based on how districts have been drawn. It creates an unfair distribution of power that doesn't accurately reflect the will of the voters. And we'll talk about briefly Michigan and the gerrymandering in Michigan and how that reflected outcomes that did not reflect explicitly the will of the voters. And finally, excuse the political process to create extreme policy choices. If you think about how a lot of elected representatives, especially at the state and national level, are selected, it's through basically a party nominating process. And the party elite or the party activists are more ideological in their approach and their perspective. And so what you get is a party where candidates will cater to the party activists, reflect their interests, because those are people who are going to nominate them, and then they get an office. If you've gerrymandered the map so that one party or the other has a predominant advantage in the electoral process, then they will come with political positions and policies that are not reflective of the population as a whole. A couple of examples, because people ask me, what does a gerrymandered map look like? Well, here's a couple of examples. One on the left is an example of packing, and this is a Republican gerrymander in Ohio. And what happened was that they took two Democratic districts, one in Toledo, one in Cleveland. They connected them based on a thin strip of land along Lake Erie, and packed as many Democrats as they could in that district. That is so thin. If you look there at the right end, it's so thin that if the lake level rises too much, it's unconstitutional because you have to have a contiguous or a district that's all one piece. So that's a problem with that map. And there's significant different policy interests between Toledo and Cleveland, which results in really challenges in how that the representative is going to represent the interests of the district. It represents challenges for the people in that district of getting their interests met. And it reduces the potential for more even representation in Ohio. The one on the right is a Democratic gerrymander. That's an example of cracking, where what they did was they drew this district that has no rhyme or reason to it other than party benefit. That it divides Republicans amongst multiple districts. That one district includes parts of 4 counties and the cities of Baltimore. And the result is that the representative doesn't understand what the specific interests are in his area because they aren't tied by anything other than the party connection. And also the people in that district, if they have a problem, if there's a natural disaster that affects one of them, there's no consistency among their representation, and that ensures that they're going to get their needs met. So this is something that doesn't meet the needs of the voters, doesn't meet the representatives' ability and need to represent them effectively. Flint, Michigan is a great example of how gerrymandering results in effectively policies that aren't supported by the people, and it impacted public health. In 2011, like in a lot of places, Republicans got a trifecta through the elections where they had both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion. With that, what they did was they drew new maps that heavily favored Republicans, and they passed an emergency manager bill. Because you think about the Republican policy interests was around financial management and austerity and balance your budget. But they could only do that at the state level. They couldn't force cities to do that. So the emergency manager bill was an effort by the state government to take control and establish financial controls over Democratic-led cities such as Detroit, Flint, Lansing, and others. So they passed this emergency manager bill in order to be able to put somebody in place to manage those budgets that were out of whack, were challenged. Well, in 2012, their voters rejected the emergency manager bill. It turned out that there was a provision in the Michigan Constitution that allows the voters to have a public citizen referendum on a bill passed by the legislature as long as it did not appropriate money, and vote on whether they want to keep that. 52.7% of the people of Michigan, 2012 election, rejected that emergency manager bill. Now, if you look at what happened with the vote in the legislature, 53% of the people voted Democratic for representatives in the legislature and only 45.6% for Republicans. Yet 53% of the seats went to Republicans. So they continued to maintain a trifecta, even though they lost the popular vote and the people rejected the emergency manager bill on that referendum. And so then the Republican legislature turned around, reissued the emergency manager bill and attached funding to it so it could not be rejected by the public, by the voters. And then subsequently put the 2013 emergency manager bill into place in place in Michigan, in Flint, to oversee their budget. Subsequently, in late 2013 or 2014, made the decision to shift the Flint water supply from the city of Detroit water supply to the Flint River, which then resulted in the degradation of the piping in the city of Flint and the lead contamination, which caused that public health crisis, which directly impacted the health of the public in Flint, Michigan. This is by people not elected by the people of Flint, in contradiction to the will of the voters of Michigan, that this was done. And there was no path of accountability at that time in order to say this is not what the people want. So this is, I think, a really compelling example of why does redistricting matter? Why is it important to make sure those maps are drawn to make sure that the government is representative of the interests of the people? A little closer to home, Minneapolis. I can't say this was deliberate because I wasn't there and I don't have the documents, but there's specifics about how the city of Minneapolis was redistricted for wards for their city council. Each color in these is a different ward. On the left, that's the Powderhorn area of Minneapolis. That's a majority minority area. The largest minority group is Hispanic. And that was 4 different wards at the time until 2010. On the right is a Cedar Riverside area. If you're familiar with that area, it is a majority minority and majority Black area with largely Somali American population. That was also likewise divided into 4 different wards. Again, very difficult to get people's voices heard when they're split between different representatives. And there's other cases of this in other states. I think this is a really compelling example close to home. So what happened? In 2010, the Minneapolis voters approved a change to the Independent Redistricting Commission a change to the Charter Commission in Minneapolis to establish an Independent Redistricting Commission. That commission's advisory panel, 9 members to the Charter Commission in Minneapolis. And that provides input to the Charter Commission on how the district should be drawn. The outgrowth of that, they had the most diverse city council in Minneapolis history in the 2012 elections. The first Somali American council member, the first Mexican American council member, and the first Hmong American council member in the city of Minneapolis. So this resulted in a council that had more inclusion of the voices of the community, of the voices of the city than had been in the past. So very important to having input of the public, the communities, and drawing those maps. The last example I'll give you is with the city of Rochester. This represents the state Senate and state House districts in the city of Rochester and Olmsted County. What this shows you is that the Senate district line goes right through the middle of Rochester, and it's divided between the two Senate districts. 10 years ago, and this is really where you have to think hard about your community interests, and are you going to be put together with other areas with similar related community interests so your voices are amplified and heard. 10 years ago, the city of Rochester said, we think we're going to benefit from having more representation in the Senate. So you got 2 state senators. And at that time, Republican policy interests were somewhat different than they are today. I've heard the mayor of Rochester say is that, this arrangement isn't working well for the city of Rochester because you got two Republican state senators elected by very small margins who are heavily drawn by rural interests in Olmsted County and other counties in southeastern Minnesota that may not be as supportive and receptive to the policy interests of the city of Rochester. So that reinforces that it's really important to think about those interests are. Again, I talk about not focusing on the D's and the R's, but sometimes that's helpful to see how have things been drawn. And what you see here is that you've got in the House, you got 2 DFL districts. They have very healthy margins from a DFL standpoint. You have one Republican who's got a pretty strong margin, one very marginal Republican district. That tells you that there's a good bit of mixing in those policy interests. and they may not be getting served as well as the public would benefit. What I want to do is stop real briefly here, just see if there's any questions about those examples. And again, we'll take the general questions at the end. So Bridget, anything at this point before I head on?
We don't have any questions specific to your example, so we're going to save the one question we do have for the end at this time.
Great, thank you. All right, so what I'm going to talk about is how are maps drawn in Minnesota? And I'll get down to the city, county level a little bit. So it's helpful to think of redistricting in three pieces. Like any business process you might see, anything like that. It's the people, the process, and the principles. The people is who are making decisions, who are taking the actions, who are drawing the maps. Includes the people identified and selected, what their authority is, that kind of thing. The principles are the rules. What rules do you have to follow, especially principles in doing redistricting, and what do you have to follow? And finally is process. How are they drawn? This gets into things like public input, public hearings, feedback, responsiveness. What is the process on that? And here in Minnesota, the way this works is the legislature draws the maps and the governor approves or vetoes. That's the way basically 32 states out of 50 do business, is that the legislature draws the maps, the governor approves or vetoes the maps. Principles, there's very little in the way of principles in Minnesota. There's no criteria. This is something I'll talk about here in a moment, that says you have to consider all of these things as priorities or as policy considerations when you draw maps. There's some things that are driven by law, including equality and population. You can't have the effect of diluting racial or ethnic minority voting strength. And the state of Minnesota says you have to have convenient, contiguous territory. And there's some other things about district numbering and things like that, but that's really all there is to it. And then from a process standpoint, there's really nothing in Minnesota Constitution or Minnesota law or federal law that says, how do you do this? What's the requirement on public hearings? Do you require public input? What public review is there beyond meeting the public meeting law that applies to anybody in Minnesota? So lacking all of those things, what happens? Well, between 1913 and 1959, there was no redistricting of legislative districts in Minnesota because there was no federal requirements. There was no, the federal courts didn't weigh in. They said, and there was a case in 1946 where the U.S. Supreme Court specifically said, hey, this is not our business, that redistricting in whole is a political process, not the role of the courts. That resulted in significant disparities in representation in Minnesota, because you think about between 1913 and 1959, there's a lot of migration from rural areas to urban areas, a lot of migration from the south to the northern urban areas, a lot of growth in industry in the urban areas. So your vote in rural parts of Minnesota was worth 10 times what a vote was in the metro area, in the cities like in Minneapolis. So the Supreme Court case in 1964 basically said one person, one vote. It took multiple Supreme Court cases to really make the point and really lay the legal foundation for that. But by the mid 60s, everybody knew or should have known that the requirement is that districts, state districts, federal congressional districts, and even county commissioners and city council districts should be of equal population. I talked about earlier, congressional legislative maps since 1960, except for that one in 1971, a congressional map. All the rest have either been rejected by the courts or been drawn by the courts. And the last three, basically, they couldn't get agreement between the legislature and the governor, and so the courts drew the last three sets of maps. Court-drawn maps meet legal minimum requirements. And you think about what I said a moment ago about that 1946 Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court doesn't get involved in politics. They don't set policy. They determine what's legal. And so what the courts do is they will do what's necessary to ensure that the maps are legal. And that starts with making sure that the populations are equal. And the courts will take what's called a least change approach, which is they're going to make the least change they can to the maps to make them legal. And they're going to make sure they're convenient, contiguous. They're going to make sure that they're equal in population within one, literally within one, based on census data. And they're going to make sure that the minorities are not prevented an opportunity to gain representation. So they're going to do that, and that's the legal minimum. They will take input and they will look at other things like communities of interest and political subdivisions, but those are not legally required. This process, there's really limited public input and transparency. The court will have some hearings, public hearings. The input, I wasn't there, but what I've been told is there's limited opportunity for input. It's really driven by the legal requirements. And because it's not looking at policy and what's in the policy interests of the people in the communities, then it's probably not in the best interest of the people. Now think about, it's been at least 30 years since a set of maps was drawn by the legislature, 40 years, you go back to 1980, that was adjusted by the courts. We've had incremental change since 1980 for the last 40 years. And literally since 1960, everything has been drawn or rejected by the courts. We probably don't have maps that really reflect what the needs of the people are in Minnesota, the needs in your community. So that's a big reason why we ought to be able to change this process. So your takeaway from this is the current system doesn't work. If you continue trying to do something and you can't reach agreement, it doesn't work, it's rejected by the courts, that said that process doesn't work. And as Einstein once said, the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. What happens if we have split government, and every 10 years since 1960, we've had split government, so we've been lucky. Okay, if you have split government, you can't agree and the courts draw the map. If one party controls the state government, a trifecta, which we have not had in Minnesota, maps are likely to be drawn to the benefit of the governing party. Now, whether they're drawn to an excessive point where they would draw some kind of reaction is a question, but likely be drawn. And that's the history says that that's going to happen. The federal courts, there was a Supreme Court case in 2019 based on some of these really egregious gerrymanders. One in North Carolina, the one in Maryland, which I reviewed. The Supreme Court said, not our problem. Partisan gerrymandering is a partisan political issue. It belongs with the states, and the states have jurisdiction. The Minnesota state constitution lacks language which would probably enable us to take advantage of the courts. One of the things lawyers have told me when I've worked with them in the past is whenever you go to court, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know. You don't know what the arguments are going to be and how that's going to be received by the judge or judges that are hearing the case. There's in North Carolina and Pennsylvania, they've managed to overcome gerrymandered maps, or at least have them redrawn based on language in their state constitutions around fair and equal elections. We don't have that same language in the Minnesota state constitution, so we don't have some of that legal protection that other places might have. So what I say is, and I've seen editorials and opinion pieces say, well, Minnesotans like divided government. Yeah, there's a lot of things I like, and it's, I like it until I don't have it. And then I'm not going to like it. And I'm counting on luck to give us divided government so that one party or the other doesn't, abuse the process to partisan benefit. Again, this isn't about the individuals. This is about the party collectively. And that's Russian roulette. We're taking chances. Now, this time around, we're lucky in that we have divided government. The DFL has the House, the Republicans have the Senate, the DFL has the governor's mansion. There's no indication there's going to be any agreement between those parties. But in 2030, we don't know. And so this round of redistricting is another just reinforcement that the current process doesn't work. So what I'm going to talk about is how maps could be drawn. What are some ideas about and what's done in other states? Remember I said that 32 states have the legislature draws them, the governor approves them. That means 18 states do something different. Redistricting commissions, there's 18 states that have some flavor of redistricting commissions. And this is a whole discussion on itself about redistricting commissions, independent commissions, advisory commissions, political appointee commissions, and so on. All of those to some extent require some level of bipartisanship, and it creates a situation where one party or the other can't make a decision without the other party's buy-in or concurrence or agreement to the outcome. It doesn't prevent everything from happening, but it does provide some check in things like legislative commissions or political commissions. The other thing is establishing criteria. And I mentioned that the only rules we have in Minnesota outside of the courts will have some things they've developed over time by precedent for how they draw districts. But if the legislature draws different districts and the governor approves them, they are only bound by what's in law. And if somebody goes to the Supreme Court and says, hey, I don't like how they did this, the Supreme Court is going to say what is illegal or what's contrary to the Constitution in Minnesota about what they did. You got to be able to point to the law. And currently, there's nothing there from the things like communities of interest, which is really, I think, the key and what we think collectively in the League of Women Voters and in the campaign, our redistricting campaign, our Maps Minnesota, is that communities of interest are one of the premier things that we need to be thinking about is where are those shared policy interests. Preservation of American Indian reservations, especially when we talk about congressional districts, is important to give them adequate voice and representation. Preservation of city, county, and township boundaries, not favoring a party or candidate. Almost everybody puts that into their language about not favoring a party or candidate. And some other things that people consider is like compactness, which is not normally legally required. And you can draw districts that look really pretty and compact, but they may not be representative. Competition, and so on. So those are all things that we think are important to get into law and be considered in the redistricting process. But currently, those aren't legally required. And so when you get the court, you take, like I said, a gerrymandering case to court in Minnesota, those are not in law. And therefore, you don't have much grounds on which to file suit. The other thing which is important and which I've become more sensitive to is the opportunity for public input. This is not just transparency, which is saying, well, we'll draw maps, we'll have hearings, we'll give you opportunity to give comment. And there's a certain amount to which that comment, is it real public comment receptiveness and incorporating and responding to those comments, or is it really for show and that the maps are going to be drawn? I'm working with one county where that was the situation. This county commissioners drew maps, they had a hearing, allied input, next day they issued the maps. Okay, there was a token representation of public input, but it really wasn't. So it's real input. A number of states, 28 states, have formal mechanisms for public input and engagement in the redistricting process, where people can provide maps or provide comments or requirements for public review and requirements for public challenge in court of the maps. So, Minnesota is not one of those 28. Allowing citizens to contribute their own maps. 8 states do that opportunity, or states like, really progressive states like Utah and Oklahoma, they have public portals where the public can submit maps to the process. So, those are states that we could look at and model that behavior. The county I'm in, Washington County, we're talking to our county commissioners about having a portal on our county site to allow the public to input maps and comments on maps, to allow that to be an easier, more open process. So public input and engagement, this is a process part of redistricting. So what I'm talking about is, okay, so we've talked about this stuff. Where do we go from here? We've got this background on how it works, how it's worked, and how that's worked for the people of Minnesota, what it could look like. This map shows you how the populations have shifted in Minnesota in the last 10 years. This is based on census data through 2019. This is what's called American Community Survey, which is not as accurate as census data, but it's pretty darn good. The blue are areas on both of these are areas that are below the ideal population, which means that they have had either less population growth or population loss relative to the areas in brown. Areas in brown are where population has increased relative to the areas in blue, or the average district population. What that means is that the areas in blue, the dark blue, are areas that are more than 4% below the ideal population for a district, for the state house districts. The areas in dark brown are greater than 4% above. That means that the dark blue areas and the light blue areas are going to have to get bigger. The brown areas are going to have to get smaller to encompass fewer people. That means all of those lines are going to change. Okay, so that is just reinforcing that this is going to happen. Those lines are going to change. And the question is, how do you want those lines to be changed? What voices do you want to be heard? How do you want your policy interests to be represented in the legislature and in Congress? If you look at the map on the left, you can see where the metro areas are in the state. From the far upper left, that's Moorhead. Then you get St. Cloud, get the Twin Cities Metro, especially Northwest and Southwest Metro in Minneapolis. Um, and then you've got Mankato and kind of South Central and Rochester in the Southeast. So those metropolitan areas are the areas that have seen relatively greater growth, relatively greater population density. Again, those districts are smaller. On the right, what I show is the metro area and how those are relate to one another. And I circled Ramsey County there. You see that a lot of Ramsey County is a little bit above, so there's going to be some shifting of lines there as well. So our strategy in the League of Women Voters, we have our People Power Fair Maps campaign. Following that Supreme Court case in 2019, I think to some extent that case did us a favor because it said we can't just rely on the home run in the Supreme Court to change policy for the whole country at once. That would be really great. And that's what happened in the 60s. It took really 3 or 4 different Supreme Court cases to get to one person, one vote and get that redistricting principle established. But states are where the state constitutions, the state courts, the state legislators, that's where these things have to get changed, at least at this point. And so it's our philosophy is on a state-by-state basis to do 3 things here in Minnesota is, first of all, engage communities and influence state and local officials to create maps. This is creating maps locally of your community to provide to city officials, county officials, legislators, say, this is what our community is, and this is the voices that need to be heard. These are the interests that we have in this community and why it's important to us and important that we have effective representation. We are continuing to advocate for legislation to change the redistricting process. And that may not go far this year based on all the dynamics in place, but it's critical we continue to advocate for that, continue to reflect that the process as it currently exists in our state laws and state constitution don't work. They either don't work, can't be used, or they create a vulnerability to our democracy that's just totally unacceptable. And finally is engaging in legislative legal process with testimony and alternative maps. Another opportunity to use those efforts at a community level to testify to the legislature or provide testimony to a special redistricting panel or elsewhere in order to reemphasize and communicate those interests. So some of the opportunities for action. And I'll tell you that our goal and my goal with the League of Women Voters Minnesota is to enable our local leagues and individuals, members or non-members, to engage in those aspects of redistricting that most interest them in a way and to a degree that works for them. This is not a one-size-fits-all. We know that every person has their specific areas of interest and they have their own levels of capacity and interest. So we want to work with you and work with your organization on that. Some specific things, we have postcard and letter campaigns. We have postcards and stamps and talking points, and we will support your league or your organization with those cards, those talking points to get out to state and local officials to emphasize to them your interest and your desire to have an open, fair, representative process for redistricting. Engaging in advocacy for legislation. Talk to us about how to advocate. You can send, simply you can take some of those talking points. You can send emails to various folks. You can meet with your legislators or others. So to let them know what your interest is. Get involved in state maps, and talking about your community maps and drawing maps. Get involved locally. And part of that local involvement is the opportunity to engage with county commissioners, the charter commission in St. Paul, and other groups in order to tell them what you expect and see what they do. Put the visibility on it, what they're doing. Because like anybody, like all of us, we tend to pay most attention to where the most spotlight is, where the light is, where the attention is. If there's more attention on redistricting or some attention on redistricting, which it frequently doesn't get a lot of attention, especially in the city and the county level, there's more likelihood there's going to be some responsiveness and some interest by those elected officials. So I want to, for the League of Women Voters St. Paul, and I think if you're part of another organization or you're interested in working with us, consider forming a team to learn more. There's a lot of depth to this. I think the best approach for an organization is to get a small number of people who are really interested in this topic, and I will work with you, provide some additional information, training, access to tools, access to other information and presentations. to learn more about redistricting and where you can apply your efforts and your energy to make a difference. If you've got a local program advocacy team or board, consider what works for you. If you're an individual, assess what your level of interest is. And again, I don't expect that everybody is going to have the same level of interest, but if you're somebody who's really interested in this, let me know. My email address, phuffman@lwvmn.org. You can go to League of Women Voters Minnesota, www.lwvmn.org, and I'll find me there under the staff names. Send me an email. Let me know what your interest is. So that's the next steps. One thing I'll talk about, and the question came up, and I don't think I covered it fully, about redistricting in St. Paul. The way St. Paul redistricting works is the Charter Commission is the one who draws the lines in St. Paul. I've gone through the St. Paul Charter, city charter, and that's where you have to go for this kind of thing. There's very little in the city charter. It just says that the Charter Commission is responsible for drawing the lines. And then it points back to state statute. It does have some words about having hearings, but it's not very detailed. It doesn't mandate a certain number of hearings. The county commissioners, they follow, and there's I will send out to the league here, and I'll put into the chat for folks, some links when I'm done. But there's a legislative redistricting guide. The latest issue that's online is 2011. The Secretary of State's office is updating that, which should be out here in the next month or so. But that's the guideline that's used by the counties. Again, very little specifics about how they do what they do. It's really up to them. And so there's a lot of opportunity to engage with the Charter Commission, engage with the county commissioners on how they're going to do that, opportunities for public input and involvement, and how the process works. And I would point back for the city and the city charter back to the Minneapolis experience of having some kind of advisory commission to the Charter Commission in order to allow the input. It's a little late to do that in this cycle, but there's no reason the Charter Commission can't model that without changing their charter and work toward that in the future, so that in the future that charter can be more inclusive of the people and the voices of the city of St. Paul. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, and I appreciate all of your attention and your listening and the questions that you've had and what I expect to get. And thanks. So Bridget, back to you for questions.
All right, we have some great questions in the chat. Thank you all so much for being so engaged in this presentation. So the first question for Paul tonight comes from an anonymous attendee who's asking, how effective are commissions in creating the districts?
Well, that's a good question. So it depends on how you measure effectiveness. I think one good way of measuring effectiveness is how many maps get overturned in court. And of the last cycle, in the 2010 cycle of redistricting, only one commission map was overturned in court out of 9 maps, 9 or 11 maps. It's an odd number. That one was Idaho, where they violated the state constitution by dividing a county. That was, nobody knows when I talk to people why that happened. That was a mistake. All the rest of the maps that were drawn by commissions were accepted by the courts. If you look at how legislatures fared, 1/3 of legislatively drawn maps were rejected by the courts. If you look at those that were drawn by political commissions, fully half of those were rejected by courts. Another way to look at it is efficiency. And so, for example, the Wisconsin maps were not rejected by courts, but they're highly inefficient. What that means is they have a lot of wasted votes, people's votes who don't count. And so that's another way of looking at it. That's a really great question. I've not looked at basically a chart of efficiency versus commissions and see what that is. And I'll take that away from here and I'll send that back to the league. I think that's a really great question. Ideally, you would see a much fewer wasted votes if you have independent commissions, because you wouldn't have so much focus on the cracking and packing.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Our next question is from Karen Willis. How do mappers deal with very rapidly changing communities? For instance, the Coon Rapids, Champlin, Anoka Ramsey, or Egan Apple Valley areas where the nature of community in 2020 may look very different from 2023 due to rapid population growth in suburban cities.
Well, that's a great question. I think a part of the problem is you have to look at what the data is today and what the communities are today. And you've got to be careful. I've not heard anybody talk about trying to forecast what that is. But what you can do is, for example, if you're in an area, I'm just thinking about some of the discussion I've had with, for example, Osseo, Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, which have very different demographics. It's one school district. You can talk about what your community is and what your community interests are. And if you're in a community that's more of a outer ring suburb, you may have more influenced by rural interests, less growth, less focus on transportation. If you're in an area that's anticipating growth, you may want to focus more on transportation. So therefore, you may want to make sure that's how you consider your community. But this gets back to considering communities of interest. If you're just somebody who's looking at the map, looking at the numbers, and you're looking at demographics, you're looking at economics, you're only dealing in what is the data today. And this is why we say communities of interest are so important, because you can draw, again, an infinite number of maps that are legal from the comfort of your office, but you can't understand what's important to people unless you go talk to them. And so it's a matter of talking to those people in those areas, understanding what's important to them, and so they can have the appropriate input to the elected officials, whether it's city councils or county commissioners or legislators.
All right, thank you. So this is a question from Betsy, whose last name I am hesitant to pronounce. I'm going to call her Betsy W. Assuming we lose a congressional seat, how does the decision get made which congressmen or women will lose their seat?
Great question. And I've seen this tendency that people say, well, I was in a program with Representative Mary Murphy, who's the chair of the House Redistricting Committee in Duluth. And I was talking to her, on this, and she was there, and she was like, well, we're not going to lose the 8th district, or we're going to lose the 6th district. We're going to, I think the problem is, and this is the problem with the least change approach of the courts, is they may look at a way to keep the districts relatively aligned with where they are, and then try to figure out how to make the least change instead of the best change for the state of Minnesota. So, that's going to be the dilemma to the courts. All the legislators are going to have to run for re-election in 2022. And matter of fact, all of our state senators and state House representatives have to run for election in 2022. So they'll all be up for re-election. So they'll all be competing with somebody. And so it's just going to be a matter of how those lines get drawn. Since the courts are going to draw the lines, they generally have tried to avoid putting 2 representatives in the same district because they don't want to take that political action. That's unavoidable. So I think it's going to be based on the testimony that goes into the courts, is going to determine that, which again is why this whole process of running public input to the courts is so important, because it's what's going to happen is both parties, I guarantee you, both parties are working on maps right now. Even though the legislature is not doing anything, the parties are, and they're going to have their idea about what those maps ought to look like. And so if we want to make sure that the representation provides is the best for the whole people of Minnesota, not just one party or the other, we need to have our voices in that.
All right, we have a question from Jack Byers. Can you please speak to how the delay in the 2020 census and the redistricting process might impact the timing of candidates filing for the next round of elections at state and local levels?
I think in Minnesota, the short answer is it won't, because what we expect is that and that's why the Supreme Court, there's already a case to the Supreme Court on redistricting that was filed about a month ago. It was filed in circuit court. It was appealed to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has accepted it, and they've done what they've done in the last 3 iterations. They put it in abeyance. They're waiting for the legislature to act or not act. And what they'll do is they'll establish that redistricting panel in August, probably sometime. and they will be ready to issue maps on February 15th based on the census data that we should get in August, September. So it should not impact candidate filing, because that February 15th date is based on the ability to support all the rest of the 2022 dates.
All right, we have our final question from Karen Willis. Could it be argued that the fact that we have never achieved a trifecta means that the court-drawn maps are successful? Are they preventing one party from dominating, and is that a good thing, or is this just a recipe for gridlock?
Well, what I suggest is we've had split government is luck. It's not by design. And so we've ended up in the courts by luck, not by design. And so, there's in my time in engineering, what we said was that luck is not a barrier. I mean, that's not something you can rely on every time to work for you. So, we've been lucky. Now, if there's a trifecta and whichever party has it in 2030, they will draw maps with the current rules. The current rules don't say anything about communities of interest, doesn't say much about other criteria, doesn't say much about public input. And so they could draw whatever maps they want. So you go back to Wisconsin in 2011, 2012. Nothing prevents that from happening in Minnesota. And because our state constitution doesn't really protect us because of the lack of wording about fair and equal elections, nothing prevents us from going down the same path as Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and so on. And I will tell you that once you've been gerrymandered, it is decades, plural, decades to fix it, because the same gerrymandered representation that put those maps into place last time is the gerrymandered representation which will draw the next set of maps. And so what you get is potentially incrementally better, which the people I talked to in North Carolina say that. And Wisconsin's the same deal, is they're going to go to the courts in Wisconsin. It's going to get incrementally better, but it's not going to be fixed for decades. So I don't think the courts work. I think we end up at the courts because that is the last line of defense if the legislature doesn't do its job. And I for one do not want to rely on luck for the health of our democracy.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Paul. So as we wrap up our presentation tonight, we have a few final words. Again, thank you so much to Paul. It has been a real pleasure to have you all here for the League of Women Voters presentation on redistricting. Big thanks to Paul Huffman for his fantastic presentation. So directly at the end of this presentation, a brief survey will pop up. If you are on Zoom, if you are so willing, we would really appreciate it if you could take that to give some feedback on tonight's event. We offer these events on the last Tuesday of every month at 7 p.m. If you like this program and want to see it again or any of our past programs, please check out our YouTube channel, League of Women Voters St. Paul. We hope that you'll join us next month for our program when we discuss the rebuilding of University Avenue. This program will be Tuesday, April 27th at 7 p.m. Once again, big thank you to the St. Paul Neighborhood Network and SCC TV for their ongoing support. Thank you all so much for watching. Have a wonderful evening.